Let's have prayer as we begin. Our kind, most gracious Father God in heaven, we invite your Holy Spirit's presence here so that we can to know you and love you and serve you better. We pray that you would give us the help that we need as we approach your word, that we may understand it and apply its lessons. In Jesus' name, amen. I forgot this. Okay, so we had prayer and invite the Holy Spirit. Now, again, remember that if you ask the Apostle John what he thought, what did he mean by what he said, you look at what he says in, we'll come back to this, but this is just a reminder that's very important, that in John 1, verse 19, no. What am I saying? I meant to say Revelation. In Revelation 1:19, comparing Revelation 1:19, Jesus says, and this helps us to place the primary, what are these messages to the seven churches? And this helps us to understand that it's not just us deciding what this is about, but what was in John's mind. And that's the important thing. And in Revelation 1:19, he says, write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. Now, if you just look at that simply, what has John already seen at this point, as of verse 19? Well, who's speaking to him, first of all, is Jesus. Yeah, and you know that because if you go to the previous verses where Jesus appears to John in a vision, and this is a vision of the Son of Man. Interesting that it doesn't use the term Jesus here in the vision, but we know who that is because of the description in terms of what is being said about this figure and what he says about himself. And so, there's a lot that we need to, that jumps out at me as I see, but this is interesting that Jesus was taken in vision. Verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me. Now notice he says, I heard behind me. He hears, but he doesn't see a loud voice as of a trumpet saying, he doesn't see the person right off. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And what you see, write in a book and send it to the seven churches, as we've read that. Okay, so this is what he has seen, okay? And the description, he turns around. Now he sees the person he's speaking to, and he sees this vision. He sees this vision of a glorified Christ and the Son of Man dressed like a garment, his hair and his head like white wool, as white as snow, his eyes like a flame of fire, his feet were like fine brass, and etc. This amazing description of Jesus. Now, this is a pattern that we find in the book of Revelation that gets very significant when it comes to understanding several things. This pattern, he hears something, he turns, and then he sees the source of that. All right. This shows up again and again. And it also shows up in relationship to our current Sabbath school lesson in terms of the 144,000. Okay. He doesn't see the 144,000. He hears the 144,000. And then he turns and then he sees. Okay, so that's a very significant pattern. Those are the kinds of things that, as they repeat, help you to know that it helps you identify. It's like a key to understand what's being described, and what you're seeing that what's being described is it's not up to us to make the decision as to what that is. We have to go to the Bible text to be able to have the key to interpret, and a clue, you might say, a clue as to what is in the prophet's mind, not just because it comes up to our mind. All right. Now back to 119. So write the things which you have seen. Well, he has just seen this vision of Christ. Now he says, write the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. So there's three categories: past, present, future. Okay? Okay. So, and this is the text that I'm showing on the screen is the New King James Version of the Bible. Okay, and then what follows is the things which are. The things which are, which is the messages to the seven churches. Now, we talked about Ephesians, and last time the message to the church in Ephesus. Tonight we're going to talk about the message to the church in Smyrna. And going back to chapter 4, verse 1, Revelation 4, verse 1, going forward. And now, just for context here, this preceding chapter 4 is the message to the church of Laodicea. Okay, so and then it goes on, after these things, the things which are, I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, who's the first voice? It's Jesus, yes. He says, the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking to me, saying, come up here, and I will show you the things which must take place after this. You see, in the language is just, in the original language is identical. Okay? So the things which will take place after this. So where in between is the things which are. And that's the messages to the seven churches. So primary interpretation of here, it doesn't rule out the idea that the seven churches can nicely sum up major phases in Christian history. It doesn't rule that out at all. That would be a secondary application. And I think it nicely fits that, as I said. The primary application, though, is that these seven messages went to the churches at that time. And, can you imagine the prophet writing this to the seven churches? And I'm not talking about you guys. This is for hundreds, thousands of years later. Okay, this has nothing to do with you. And that's strange, because this is the message to the seven churches. And I think God always starts with people where they are. And now, one aspect of our historicist or typical Adventist readings of prophecy is that it always starts with the time of the prophet where they are. You understand? So, like Daniel, he was in that head of Babylon, the gold head that represented Babylon. So it went from Daniel's time, and then it went forward into the future from there. So these messages that come through to John are starting with his time. So the things that you have seen, this vision, the things which are the 7 churches, primary application. These apply to the churches right where they are. And then come up here and I will show you the things which must take place after this. That's everything after the 7 churches. So again, there is an application. These do make sense in applying them to certain phases within Christian history. So just reiterating that. So now we're going to go back to the message to the church in Smyrna. Having said that, so Revelation 2 verse 8, it says, "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last." We know who that is, right? The first and the last. That was part of the vision that came to John. These things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. That's part of the vision. And now he addresses the Smyrna church. And the Smyrna church is one thing where there's not really anything to correct here in this message to the church in Smyrna. This church is a positive church. It's kind of like the Church of Philadelphia in that regard. In fact, those two parallel each other, the Smyrna and Philadelphia, in that those are good. Those are messages which do not contain any negative censure on Christ's part. So Jesus says in verse 9, "I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. And you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death." Okay, now, amazing in how Jesus adapts to the needs of the church in order to give them encouragement. Do you see that? What stands out here to you about this message? Welcome, come on in. What stands out in this message to you so far?
His affirming language.
He's very affirming in his language.
He's not really congratulating, but supporting them, saying, "Hey, keep it up.
Mm-hmm.
If you're faithful,
Okay, all right. Be faithful. And you can do it. Obviously implied only through Jesus. Yeah. And so, anybody else? What's in this message to the church in Smyrna? Welcome. Let me just read it again, all right, as we go through it. "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life." Now that's part of the overall vision of Jesus that John sees in Revelation chapter 1. Any ideas as to how or or why he would use that part of the vision to talk to give a message to the church in Smyrna? Why would he say, well, the first and last, that's part of his title, but then who was dead and came back to life? Why would Jesus use that part of the vision? He was dead and he came back to life.
Confirm who he is.
Well, it does confirm who he is. I think that's true, and I like that very much. Do you think that might be relevant to the church in Smyrna? And why would it be relevant? Yes?
Aren't they going through persecution?
Well, they're presently going through various stages of persecution, yes.
So this would mean that they didn't need to be afraid of death.
Mm-hmm.
These was our example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We were going to have to see it.
This message is designed to help people who are undergoing suffering, to help them know that they don't have to be afraid. You see that? Yeah. I'm paraphrasing a little bit of what you said, Gladys, but did that paraphrase it well enough? Did I summarize what you're? I mean, does that sound kind of like what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Okay. They're in a very scary time, and they don't have to be. There are some things we always need to be afraid of, but is death one of them? I mean, if Jesus was dead and he came back to life, well then, well, there's hope, right? There's hope for us. Yeah. It's a message that says basically we really have nothing to fear. Not from persecution, not from suffering, not from death. There's nothing. Whatever happens, certainly, whatever happens, we could say, if it happens, then God knows we must be able to handle it, right? Yeah. So, okay, we're going on. So he says, I know your works, tribulation and poverty. And this word tribulation could be translated as afflictions. And it carries with it the idea that it's outward pressure. Pressure is being brought to bear on someone. But it's outward pressure mostly. Of course, with outward pressure comes something else. And with that outward pressure comes, and I think that's why we're talking about fear. Fear is a type of stress. And so there can be psychological stress that they're experiencing. And so I love the fact that Jesus doesn't want to, just keep going in the path you're going. All right? That's beautiful. Just hang on. Hang on. Yes.
I once knew this teacher, Teresa James. Very, in my opinion, she was very, dedicated to the work. And it was kind of shocking to me after she passed away that I heard from somebody else that she was fearful of the last moments of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And she was questioning, am I going to heaven?
Mm-hmm.
Am I saved? And, and she had her fear.
Yes.
Whether she did it right, was she okay with the Lord? And I thought to myself, because she was teaching my kids, and to me, she was a very godly person.
Mm-hmm. And yet, even godly people, when they're coming close, as you're saying this in this example, when they're coming close to death, they're not free from fear. I think God has compassion on his people. He understands that. Yeah, yes.
I went and made a hospital visit years ago. One of our church members was really close to the end.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember if he was comatose, but while I was there, he sat up in bed in a hospital. He was radiant. You would have thought he was going to a wedding. And he said again and again, I'm going home. I'm going home. Before morning, he was dead.
That must have been, you witnessed that.
But he was just radiant. You couldn't believe how happy he was.
He had been almost comatose, you said, and
I don't think he thought he was going home from the hospital.
not likely. But to all of a sudden sit up and, as you're saying, to shout out again and again, I'm going home.
He didn't shout,
But it was a very emphatic statement, very emphatic. I'm going home. I'm going home, and then isn't it amazing how the Holy Spirit can come to us and give us what we need at the moment that we need it? That's a beautiful thought, so
I'll never forget that experience.
I'm sure you wouldn't. You saw that firsthand, and I'm thinking of even HMS Richard Sr. Most Adventists remember who he was, who weren't born yesterday. And HMS Richard Sr., that is at least in the North American context, and how he was, even his son had to give him assurance as he approached his final moments. Even his son, HMS Richard Jr., had to remind him that in the Lord he was going to be okay. Yes.
A.J. Potzer was the conference president in New York for quite a few years. He went on to other responsibilities. But after he retired, he had the declining years, but he had bone cancer toward the end. He wouldn't take any treatment for it. So he was 90 years old. It was far enough to do anything more.
Okay. So he wasn't afraid. Wasn't afraid. This is a message about fear, and Jesus is encouraging them not to have fear. Jesus said, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." So that's that. I like that. Yes.
After Ellen White broke her hip, she lingered for about 6 months. And they didn't do anything for hips in 1915. But I don't know where it was, somewhere along that process, she's quoted as saying, talking about them, it said, the sooner the better. Sooner the better.
There's something at this point when life has run its course, and the only thing and becomes attractive to rest until Jesus comes back. That wonderful assurance that death in the experience of those who have died is like the blink of an eye. You know how fast your eye blinks, and the next thing you know, Jesus is there. It's a beautiful thing to remember that. And what I mean by that is the next thing we know is Jesus has come and the resurrection is there. But so he says, I know your works, tribulation and poverty. Now, this is poverty conditions. You could say destitution, destitute. In those days, there was a dynamic going on, and I would say in Smyrna, there in eastern Turkey, I mean Western Turkey, close to just in that area. Those towns were very, very staunch supporters of the Roman Empire, and the system worked. I've been in at least in Pompeii, in Italy, and I've seen how they've uncovered the emblems of different guilds. They have different guilds, and that's how the society worked. They had guilds, and they were set up. And in order for you to get work, you had to be part of a guild. And in order for you to be part of a guild, in many cases, these incorporated both. We have no way of appreciating what that was like in those days. They had this mixture of civil and religious aspects of it, and to them it was all part of being civic and minded and just going through it's just the requirements of the state, and to worship the worship of the emperor was becoming greater and greater in the first century AD, stronger and stronger, and some towns were really avid about it. They wanted to demonstrate that they were supporters of the Roman Empire and the emperor. They benefited from that because then they got support, and these guilds would mix in their ceremonies to be a part of a guild. In order to have work, you'd also have to be able to offer incense, or to say the words, or to eat of a sacrifice that was offered to an idol or to the emperor or whatever it was. And so to be a functioning part of society, it's not like it is for us today. We can believe, we can worship, we can do all the things that we do, and still believe what we do, and still be good citizens of our country.
Unless you're Adele Sherbert.
Unless you're what?
Unless you are Adele Sherbert.
Adele Sherbert?
Sherbert.
Okay, I'm not familiar with the story there.
The case goes back probably at least 20 or 30 years. She lost her job on the Sabbath question.
Lost her job on the Sabbath question. Yes, there are cases of it. Of course, what's different is that they had no recourse. In those days, we have legal recourse. Well, whether or not we'll be able to find justice in the courts is a different matter. But yes, it's true. People can suffer for their faith.
She won her case.
Even in the United States.
She won the case.
And she won the case. So that's what would not be possible in the first century AD. And so their poverty, their destitution was because they could not they could not be part of the fabric of society. And how could you earn food? I mean, it was scratching a living. Destitution, which brings its own pressure. Its own pressure. Interestingly enough, so they are poor in a physical standpoint, like Jesus was basically poor and destitute. He had nowhere to lay his head, he said. And he didn't own anything except for the clothes he had on his back. And food came because people gave food and gave money. But he didn't ever have any interest in worldly goods. So that's contrasted with the fact that Jesus says they are rich. Rich in what way, would you say?
Heaven.
Rich in what?
Heaven.
In heaven? They have heaven in their hearts? Okay. They have Jesus in their hearts. Okay, yeah. We could, well, how else would we describe it? They have faith.
Yeah, everything.
They're rich in faith. They have
Everything that counts.
everything that counts. They're rich in faith. They're rich in love. this is the suffering church, but yet, and they're destitute, they're suffering afflictions, and they are going through tribulation and poverty, and which, that can bring a sense, when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, right? That brings its own stress, more so an inner stress. But Jesus is saying, you're rich. Stay that way, rich in faith, rich in love, rich in heaven, rich with Jesus in your hearts. So, and he says,
they have a treasure
treasures in heaven. Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And which is more important to have? Treasures in heaven. Yes.
You mentioned you don't know where your next meal comes from. I come from a family of 15.
15, a family of 15. Big families have a lot to provide for those. Yes.
And there were times where we were like, you know where the next meal will come from.
That's right.
And my parents being Catholic, well, we still have faith.
Yes.
Still have faith, and I look back and, Lord provided.
They had faith. The Lord provided. Yes. Well, and he goes on to say a particular type of suffering here is the blasphemy, or in this case, you might think of it more like slander. Slander, and Jesus went through that as well. So Jesus certainly can identify. I mean, he went through that experience. Slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So, and this comes after the destruction of Jerusalem, when this was written. Jerusalem is gone. And the temple is destroyed. Now the Christians had fled before. They had fled from Jerusalem. And so, now I'm not sure the exact date, so I could be wrong on this. But the Jews said, well, if you're not going to suffer with us, to the Christians, then previously Christians would worship in the synagogues with them. But they started to add some of the readings in as part of the services in the synagogues that would specifically denounce Christ. And therefore, they would know who to cast out of the synagogues. Because a Christian would not say any of the readings that would denounce Christ. And so at some point, you have to realize that people who profess to serve God but are actually serving the enemy, the Satan, in their persecution of God's people. And so those who say they are Jews, in other words, they're professing to be part of the people of God, but they're not living like it. They're not acting like it. And you remember Jesus said of the Jews, "You are like your father Satan." We're children of Abraham. No, Abraham never would do these things. So they had become more demonic in how they would treat other people. So when I say demonic, I mean just influenced by hatred and no longer caring about the decency and the respect and the rights and being the need to be humane in treatment of others. Then in verse 10, Jesus says, do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. And that I'm told that from what I hear, this do not fear means stop fearing. In the original language, it's in that tense, that original language. Stop fearing what you are about to suffer. And indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And you have tribulation 10 days. It's kind of like, it's interesting, the 10 days thing. It points back in a way you can think of. Remember how long Daniel's test was with Daniel and his 3 friends when it came to what to eat? Do you remember how long that was? It was 10 days, and they stayed faithful. And they were rewarded after 10 days. So Jesus is saying, it's kind of like back then, in Daniel's day, 10 days. You'll be tested for 10 days. And you'll have tribulation. Think of the promises. Be faithful until death, he says. And I will give you the crown of life. I mean, what could be more encouraging than that? Be faithful, stay on the course. Don't give up. Stay faithful, and I will give you the crown of life. That's the most important thing, isn't it? Is there anything more important than that? So he's saying, hang on there. Hang on, stay the course, be faithful, and I'll give you the crown of life. And so he's encouraging the church. And it goes on to say, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And then notice what it says next. Do you see that? He who overcomes. That's like, if you be faithful, you will overcome. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by what? The second death. So, as far as the death that we experience, what are we to be afraid of the most? The second death is worse than the first death, right? Yeah. So he says, be faithful. I'll give you a crown of life. And you won't have to be afraid of the second death. Okay, yes?
The apostasy that leads to the second death is much worse than the second death itself, I think.
What did you say? What leads to?
Turning away from the truth is just as bad as the second death.
Turning away from the truth is just as bad as the second death itself.
The second death is only death. It's forever.
Yes.
But if somebody is lost because I failed to help them see the truth, or if I turn them aside by an unfaithful witness, that's worse. I think so.
Okay. I was contrasting the first death with the second death. Okay. Yeah, but when in our fear of the second death, remember that what leads to it. I mean, what you're saying, Dick, makes me think of what's worse, to be a victim or to be a victimizer. Right? A victimizer would be worse. In other words, you wouldn't want to make that decision, but if you had to, you'd rather be a victim than to be a victimizer. Right? And so, in a way, that's how I understand what Dick's saying. Dick's saying is what's terrible, the second death is terrible, but to not have a part to play in or doing nothing to help someone to understand the truth.
To be an unfaithful witness.
To be an unfaithful witness. is, well, I'll put it this way, is a tragedy. It's a travesty. It's unfortunate. It's terrible. Because it means that we only care about ourselves. Yeah. So anyway, this is quite an interesting, but encouraging, because of the way Jesus approaches the church in Smyrna. Someone who's about to undergo a sharp and intense but short testing. We don't know what this is about. We don't know what this 10 days was. Now, prophetically, if you take the secondary application and you're applying this to historical phase, there was about 10 years worth of affliction that the church went through, so there's that. As far as the primary application of this, coming to the church in Smyrna and addressing the things that they were going through, the tribulation, the poverty, the fear, the complete destitution, and the coming suffering through this sharp affliction, tribulation, being tested for 10 days. What that 10 days is, I don't have that information. I haven't seen that information back then.
Is the experience of that church more important than the full prophecy that goes out of this whole Revelation book?
No, this is the phase of the things which are, as Jesus identified, the things which are. And it gets really interesting at chapter 4 and onward. Then it becomes definitely the things which come after this. I didn't explain that to you, those of you who just come in. Yes?
In this church, it's kind of like Jesus telling us that even though there's a lot of things that you could fear, he's trying to tell us don't focus on those things.
Mm-hmm.
But watch me. Look, I was dead and I have resurrected. And it's the same for us, it's like sometimes we tend to focus a lot on the signs and what's going on in the world, but we don't focus on Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when the Word of God says watch, it's not so much on those things, but watch Jesus, what he's doing, what his character is like, and what his example has been, and for us to keep that track of mind set, so we don't compromise.
I think what you're saying also suggests that this is the way for us to overcome fear. Fear is part of what the devil uses to get us off the track. And the way to overcome fear would be to make sure our eyes are still focused on him. So in a sense, this message is really saying, keep your eyes on me. And be faithful. Well, keep your eyes on me. And perfect love, the apostle says, is the casting out of fear. So by receiving love, we love him because he first loved us. And so therefore, that would be the method for making sure that fear does not have a hold on us. I mean, it's normal for us to be afraid, but not to let it dominate us, right? Because our eyes are focused on him. So, yeah. And to persevere. That's what helps us to persevere. Yes, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus. Yeah, which sounds like the book of Hebrews. All right, well, next week we're going to look at the message to the church of Pergamos, which is the compromising church, and you see the trend. It seems to be getting worse and worse and worse in the churches. And I didn't point out that this church, Church of Smyrna, that we just looked at, not this, but is rich. It's almost like the opposite of the church of Laodicea. Remember, the Laodicea church thought they were rich, but they were not. This church thinks they're poor, but Jesus says, no, you're not really poor in the things that matter the most. You are rich. And so that's an interesting way to think of the contrast between this church and the Laodicean church that only thinks they are rich. So, all right, we're going to continue with the message to the church of Pergamos next week. And now we're going to take some time for prayer. And so what would you like for us to talk about for prayer? Do you have prayer requests in mind? Yes.
Well, I just want to thank God, the lady in my hospital that she